Well, good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. On such a beautiful day in Seattle. You can't always say that, so it's great to have people here, the distinguished guests and everybody else. Welcome to the conference. I think this is a really important moment for forums like this, bringing the range of stakeholders that we have in the room today. And I really wanted to thank the National Bureau for Asian Research for bringing all these discussions together. What I thought I would do over the course of the next sort of little while is really talk about and maybe set the scene for some of the conversations that are going to take place through the balance of the day. And, I think where we find ourselves, not just in the technology industry, but frankly, across pretty much every industrial sector, and frankly, from a societal perspective as well, we find ourselves at a very interesting moment where, technology and the role that technology is playing in basically most facets of our day-to-day interactions is fundamentally shifting and changing. And one of the concepts that we've really thought about at Microsoft and looked at is this concept of the diffusion of the technology. AI is a general purpose technology in the sense that it is something that does touch upon multiple factors of industrial production and societal drivers. And so when we look at that when you look at history, when you look at the data, what is that telling us about how will AI and AI diffusion drive economic growth? Well, one of the things that is probably pretty self-evident, but which I think it's always good to ground ourselves in the reality, is that AI is the fastest technology in history in terms of tech adoption. You look at, we've now got more than 1 billion people that are using artificial intelligence and are using generative AI tools in some part of the way that they operate on a day-to-day basis. When you compare that with any of the general purpose technologies that have evolved over the course of really the past 150 years, you see that the impact and the acceleration of AI is pretty fundamental and is pretty profound. The thing that I think is important to recognize, and some work that we've done at the company with the diffusion report, is to look at the fact is that unfortunately the AI diffusion that we're seeing is not equal. And that speaks very much to, what's happening in Asia, where you have some countries like Korea and Singapore that are at the absolute forefront of AI diffusion in terms of adoption of the technology and use of the technology across their populace. But you also see a number of countries where the diffusion rate is much, much lower. And a lot of that is reflected by the fact that the technology obviously is dependent upon two things, and some of which Michael mentioned: availability of power and connectivity. If you don't have those two things, it's very hard to be working on AI. And so one of the challenges that we see across the policy domains, frankly, is how do we, as we look at the diffusion of AI, as you look at the growth of AI across countries, how do we keep in mind that there's this imbalance of the way that AI is being diffused, and what are the levers to try and drive AI diffusion to make sure that some of the technology gaps that we've seen, whether you look at the telco gap, whether you look at electrification and the disparity between use of electricity, how do you make sure that as AI gets rolled out, as AI diffuses across society, that we are looking to bridge some of these divides so that AI doesn't end up accelerating those divides? And so when we've looked at this and when we've thought about both the historical perspective of the way in which technology and general purpose technology has found its way through diffusion, there are really, I think, 3 areas, and I'll touch upon each of these in my remarks. Firstly, you have to have the infrastructure. And the infrastructure is a capital-intensive business that enables scaling. You need to have the infrastructure and infrastructure investment. And I do agree with the point that Michael made, is that this intersection of infrastructure is not just about data centers and data center infrastructure. In fact, I was at a conference in New York about 2 weeks ago that was focused on energy systems in the US and the investment approach to expanding investment across grid and electrification projects in the US. And one of the things that I took away from that was really interesting is that most of the private equity and banking organizations are actually aggregating their technology and their energy practices into one practice, because the nexus between the need for energy and technology growth has become such a fundamental part of thinking about infrastructure and infrastructure investment, that enabling and organizing their teams to look across those sets of issues is critical. The other part that we've looked at, and again, something that Microsoft has talked about a lot over a number of years in looking at IT adoption generally, but I think what we see is the need for skills to drive impact. As you look at the ability for workplace displacement to occur because of the technology, the emphasis on making sure that people have the skills, that people are identifying what skills that they need to look at job growth and job transition, the way that almost every customer that I speak to, government or private, is looking at what's the impact on their workforce. And fundamentally, that comes to looking at what are the skill sets that they have now, where are those skill sets going, and what are the ways in which they're going to best equip their workforce in order to develop the skills that are going to be needed as we look at where the AI impact is taking us. So this topic of skills, the topic of the need for skills to ensure that there's access to the capabilities to use AI is, I think, a policy discussion and, in fact, an implementation issue, because it's one that needs to be done also at scale. And then finally, and I'll touch upon some of these areas as well, but ultimately, trust accelerates adoption of the technology. And many of the topics you're going to cover today are topics which are fundamental to building trust. And I would say in the conversations that I'm having as I travel, I was in Europe last week speaking to customers in Germany, speaking to customers in France and in the Netherlands, and seeing the European Commission. And a lot of what they're looking at is really two-sided. They want to understand the technology solutions and the technical capabilities, because the technology is evolving and developing at very rapid rates. But equally, they want to understand what are companies doing, how are they contributing to the issues related to ensuring that their technology is trustworthy and that the companies operating have the right set of principles in the way in which they're developing and delivering that technology. And I can say that I don't think in all of my 24 years at Microsoft, I don't think we've seen more of an emphasis on the importance of being able to articulate clearly with our customers, not just the things that we believe in related to how trust can be developed in the technology, but as importantly, what are the things that we're materially doing to demonstrate that the principles that we have are being put into practice in the way that the technology is going to be used, developed, and deployed. So when we look at infrastructure, I think one of the things that we hear a lot about, and the concerns we hear about the infrastructure, is how do we see the infrastructure stack? Where are there opportunities for countries? Where are there opportunities for companies? Is this simply a rollout of hyperscalers across the globe? And, I think one of the things that's very important is when you look at technology adoption, when you look at technology rollout from a pure infrastructure perspective, you really need to have a good focus on what is the elements of the tech stack that is making up AI. And so what we've really thought about is when you look at that tech stack, and it starts with the electrification and connectivity, which I mentioned earlier. It is one of the key elements and one of the areas that we're deeply focused in, not just in using electricity, but how do we make sure that we're using it and addressing the environmental impacts? How do we make sure that we're addressing it and ensuring that the cost issues related to use of energy are managed? And I'll talk about that briefly. But you also have to look up this entire stack. The stack is taking, there's investments that's happening at all levels of the stack, and there's also the availability and competition that is occurring at all levels of the stack. And one of the things that diffusion of the technology, if you look historically, has taught us is that the economic impact, the economic advantage that can come from the technology rarely comes from the country alone who is developing the technology. The key is not necessarily who is building the model, it's how is that being diffused across the economy. And when you look at the opportunities across the tech stack for the different capabilities in different countries, for the different capabilities in different companies, to be able to compete, to be able to find market opportunity and to participate in the rollout of the infrastructure, we think that that's a very important notion, that this is not something that one company is going to do. This is not something that one country is going to do. And that the keys to best deployment of the technology are ultimately going to be about the growth of the overall ecosystem. One of the things that we do think is very important as you look at the rollout of infrastructure, and if you look at the rollout of infrastructure projects, historically, things like trains, things like power, one of the greatest inhibitors is the infrastructure going to be something which local communities, because ultimately if you're building infrastructure, you don't build it in one place, you build it in hundreds of small communities around the world. And what you have to ensure that if people are going to accept and if they're going to work with that technology, in other words, if they're going to allow it to be deployed in their societies, they have to have a shared view as to the benefit that's being created. And so one of the things that we have thought a lot about is to look at where are there concerns as you roll out infrastructure, particularly when you roll out data center infrastructure. And we came up with these 5 principles that really underpin our approach to infrastructure development and deployment projects globally. We focused these primarily on the US. These are a set of announcements we made earlier this year that are focused on the US, because some of the variables about what's best for water, what's best for electricity, what's best for taxes will vary by country. But these are a commitment and a framework that we're looking at ensuring that, firstly, in relation to electricity, that we will pay our way. One of the things we've been very clear on is that even as we expand data center infrastructure, we're going to maintain our commitment to renewables. And we announced earlier this year that we have achieved 100% renewable of our energy. That doesn't mean necessarily from consumption of renewables, but the total amount is covered either through the energy supply or our carbon credits. Water is a big issue for many local communities. People are concerned about water consumption. And so we can look at the ways in which we're going to meet our overall sustainability commitment to be water neutral by 2030. And in fact, we're seeing rapid advances in the technology base related to the use of water in data centers. I was remarking earlier that one of the discussions we had on the energy conference that I was at recently was people talking about sort of a 3 to 5 to 7 year horizon in relation to innovation for development of data centers. And one of the things that I sort of disagreed with in that notion is that we've looked at liquid cooling as part of now what is an essential part of data center design. Liquid cooling, really, if you were to look at it from an investment perspective, was largely sitting with startups and Series A's types of companies 2 years ago. But the pull-through and demand that the data center industry is creating to make sure that the innovations to deal with these issues related to things like electricity and water is created an accelerated innovation curve that I think is great for the way in which water, electricity, sustainability is going to be part of the overall infrastructure rollout. People are very concerned about jobs when we look at infrastructure deployment. And when you look at jobs, they're concerned not so much that the data center will not have a huge amount of jobs, but those jobs will not go to people in the local community. So you need to look at what are the programs that we have, what are the ways in which we can make sure that if there are construction jobs, if there are electrical engineering jobs, if there are electrician jobs, how are the local communities going to be trained to be able to benefit from that? Similarly, on tax, you want to make sure that the tax base, which is going to increase by property in the US by virtue of us being in location, then be able to use by local communities to improve the facilities and what's on offer in those places. And finally, the point I made about skills is with local communities to develop and enhance the skill mix across what AI can deliver for those communities. If I pivot then to the topic of skills, I think the area that we have focused on really is recognizing that every individual, every worker, every student needs to have access, to skilling. That means looking at how do you deliver skilling? What are the sorts of skills that are necessary? And so we've made a commitment, in the US to 20 million, equipping students with 20 million students in the next 2 years with AI skilling. And a lot of that's going to be developed by working how you provide the skilling programs, but implementing them into the existing education system. So that means working with local schools and local school boards. It also means looking at how we can diffuse the capability for skilling across the community colleges, which is so important in many of the rural communities and the urban communities across America. And then working also with employers and with unions. One of the things we're very proud of is the partnership we have with the ACLF in the US, where we're looking very closely at how do we help unions and their membership acquire skills that are going to ensure that they can move forward in the AI world with the necessary skills to ensure that they have employment opportunities. So that broad public agenda is, I think, a very interesting one, because if you then play that out across the way that's working across Asia, the importance of looking at the way that governments and the role that governments are going to play, the role that employers are going to play, and the role that the education system is going to play in different countries will be different by country, but the levers are similar. And looking at how those can be used to ensure that the skilling divide is addressed by diffusing the capability to get skills is something that I think is a primary policy objective and something which we're deeply committed to working on. The final topic I'll cover, and again, you'll spend a lot of time talking about those individual elements in some of the panels today, but fundamentally, and I've got a build here that is beyond my capabilities. We'll go back to here. I'm sorry, I'm not sure what happened with this one, but ultimately, I think there are multiple areas of policy development that contribute to the overall environment of trust. And when we speak to policymakers, when we speak to regulators, these are the areas which I think are most commonly addressed. Firstly, people want to know what's happening with their data. People want to understand how data is going to be handled. And AI is a complicating technology in the way that data is used. And so it's very important to have the dialogue to make sure that there is both a recognition of the value and the use of data, but also what safeguards are being put in place to make sure that the data protection environments that exist in many countries are being maintained as the technology is both being developed and deployed. Security is a really interesting topic, because security, I think, is a topic where we are seeing a rapid advance in the use of the technology by bad actors to increase the velocity and increase the scope of their attacks. And so it's equally then important to work out what is happening from a technology perspective, but how is the collective capability across societies being used to advance the defense capabilities to ensure that the threats are addressed as they rise. We do work with many of the governments in sharing threat detection information. We get somewhere north of 40 trillion signals a day at the moment. And so sharing that to ensure that the threat landscape is well understood, and that then actors can work together to make sure the issues are addressed as the technology is deployed, because the technology can also be used very effectively to enhance the capability to protect environments, not only into how they're being attacked. Safety is an issue which has been very much in the news, on the social media side in the US this week. But the digital safety issues and the safety issues related to how the technology is going to be used are very much, I think, at the forefront of policy discussion. And we see quite divergent approaches. If you look in Australia, they've taken a very prescriptive and a very defined approach there in relation to how they're going to look at digital safety generally. In other places, it's more permissive, but I think people are looking very carefully at the impacts of the technology and the way in which the technology is being used, and what are the safety elements that need to be built in. And that often then flows into what are the governance components related to the use of the technology, both from a technical perspective, but also from a deployment perspective by organizations. And finally, a topic that I spend a lot of time on the sovereignty side, and if we've got maybe 100 and something people here, we probably have 100 something definitions of what sovereignty means. It is a topic which has both a political dimension to it, has a technical dimension to it, has a legal dimension to it. And one of the things that I think is important is how do we balance the trade-offs that the sovereignty discussions are creating? There is a real trade-off, and when I talk with customers, and in fact, as I talk to governments, particularly in Europe, you see this balance between how do we make sure that we've got sovereign control at the same time as how are we making sure that we've got the right level of innovation. We need the innovation to be competitive, and at the same time, we want to make sure that we're protecting our citizens, we're protecting our societies by having sufficient control over the resources and not being completely dependent on third parties. The other aspect that they're having to make a trade-off around is on the security side. The more that you have sovereign solutions that are controlled and managed on your own premise or in your own country, it does create a security risk because your ability to see signal from the broader public internet is limited. And the war in the Gulf has, I think, re-emphasized the concern around having everything built just in your country. When we worked with the Ukraine at the start of the Ukraine war, the second missile that went into the Ukraine was into the government data center. And in the Middle East war over recent weeks, we've seen attacks on data center infrastructure that has really highlighted the importance of having a resilient architecture for the way that you're going to run IT operations in your country. Simply having them in one facility is probably not going to be the most secure. So making that trade-off across that dimension is going to be super important. So I'm sure you'll talk a lot about these as you go through the discussions today, and I hope this sets up at least the framework for those discussions. This is, I think, an important time where those three topics of infrastructure, skills, and the way that trust is evolved and developed are fully explored across the different perspectives that stakeholders have, and I think forums like today are important in helping us tease out those issues and better understand them. So have a great number of sessions today, and thank you for your time this morning.